Hey everybody, welcome back to Race of History. Today we're getting into the first video that we've ever done on the World War II Week by Week channel with Indy and Spartacus. I have seen a handful of their videos. This is one of the few entertainment historical channels that I've seen any content from, but I have seen a few of their videos, mostly from way earlier in the war. I have not seen this one. It's the 1942 Plan to Invade Europe World War II special. Let's get into it.
It's November 1942. The Soviet Union is on the brink of collapse. In southern England, 5 Anglo-American divisions are massed and ready. Soon the order will go out. Landing craft will be loaded. Destroyers set sail and bombers take to the skies. It's time to invade Europe. I'm Indy Nidell.
And I'm Spartacus Olson.
This is a World War II in real-time special examining the invasion of Europe in 1942.
Or rather, the lack of, because we took some artistic liberty with that opening. Right now, the Allies are invading North Africa, and any landing in Europe is way off in the future.
But a plan for a late 1942 landing was Anglo-American policy as recently as July of this year.
So what happened? Why has the invasion of Europe been put on hold?
So this video was recommended to me because I asked a question in one of the Eastern Front videos about whether you guys thought that if the Soviet Union was really struggling or was on the brink of collapse, if the Western Allies would have started the second front in France. And so that's what I wondered. And when I asked the question, I had somebody, Sketch maybe, who recommended this video. And so I'm hoping that that's what it kind of explains, is their ability or inability to open a second front without the Germans getting their teeth kicked in on the east.
Well, first off, Churchill has never been keen on the idea. He has always wanted to target the soft underbelly of the Axis in North Africa and Italy. As early as June 1941, he is writing to Stalin that until German defenses are substantially weakened, any attempt at landing in France would encounter a bloody repulse. This cautious strategy initially becomes Anglo-American policy at the Arcadia Conference in January 1942. The two nations agree to Europe first, the policy that Germany must be dealt with before Japan, but rule out an invasion of Europe until at least 1943. Until then, their efforts will be limited to strategic bombing, assisting the Soviets, maintaining the naval blockade, and fostering European resistance. When that invasion does come, it may not even be into Western Europe, but through that soft underbelly. That is the Mediterranean or even the Balkans.
But not everyone in the American military establishment is happy with this cautious approach. General George Marshall, U.S. Army Chief of Staff, and Admiral Ernest King, Chief of Naval Operations, believe Germany must be knocked out of the war as soon as possible so attention can turn to their real enemy, Japan. In March, Secretary of War Henry Stimson urges sending an overwhelming force to the British Isles and threatening an attack on the Germans in France. Later that month, Marshall comes up with a 3-part plan. First component, codenamed Bolero, is the buildup of 1 million U.S. troops in the United Kingdom by April 1943, culminating in an Anglo-American invasion force of 48 divisions, 30 of these American, and 5,800 RAF and USAAF aircraft. From this, 2 invasion plans are proposed. The first, codenamed Sledgehammer, is a contingency plan to be launched before the completion of Bolero as early as autumn 1942. This is in case the Soviets show signs of imminent collapse, or if Germany becomes so stretched in the war in the East that its western flank is suddenly open. Sledgehammer would send 5 divisions to establish a foothold on the Cotentin Peninsula, holding the port of Cherbourg over the winter of 1942 and 43 before being reinforced for a breakout. The second is codenamed Operation Roundup. Now, this would be launched either as the reinforcement action for Sledgehammer or independently in early 1943 after the completion of Bolero, right? A little confusing, but right. Nearly 6,000 Allied aircraft would achieve aerial superiority over the landing area, and 6 divisions would land on a front stretching from Le Havre to Boulogne. These initial landings are to be reinforced with 100,000 men per week, while British and American armor drive towards the port of Antwerp.
These plans are presented to Churchill when Marshall visits London in April. Churchill gives his agreement, and on the 14th, he urges the two nations to march ahead together in a noble brotherhood of arms. But his agreement is only really given to prevent American attention from wandering towards the Pacific, a fear that is not unfounded. By the end of this month, April 1942, 22,000 American soldiers have been shipped to Europe, but over 184,000 elsewhere, and mainly to the Pacific.
Yeah, so the U.S. doesn't want to get involved in the war. The U.S., I know, as strange as it sounds today, the U.S. has a history of isolationism. That's the way that the country was founded. It held those roots until Woodrow Wilson gave his point speech to Congress to get involved into World War I. But even after World War I, the war had been so brutal to Europe. And the U.S. had gotten involved and seen the brutality of it. They just didn't get hit as hard with that brutality as the rest of Europe had during World War I. But after World War I was over, the U.S. kind of viewed it the same way that Europe did, as we don't want to do this again. And so the U.S. gets back to its isolationism roots. And the thought process being anything that's in our region is okay. So if there's anything, in the vicinity of the U.S., then that's fine. But anything over in Europe or Asia or whatever, no, we're not doing that. We're not fighting wars over there. That's not what we're doing, right? So the U.S. does not want to get involved in this war. Obviously, the Pearl Harbor attacks changed that. Pearl Harbor to this day is one of the most meaningful American, not holidays, but anniversaries that we have in the States. It's Pearl Harbor. It's almost on the level of a holiday, like a July 4th or something like that. It's just a big deal, right? It's looked at in the same ilk as September 11th. And so because of that, there's a huge recruitment surge. There's this big push for not just the U.S. getting involved in the war, but an outright cry for vengeance. And it is portrayed in different books by different historians in different ways. But it is very clear through some of the sources that is a very big part of the surge and of the push to get into war is specifically revenge on Japan. Okay? And so that is dictating the direction that the U.S. and U.S. political and military leadership is viewing the war through. So their move is to get involved in the Pacific. They're going to push into the Pacific, and they are trying to give a blowback to Japan as fast as humanly possible, as soon as they can, right? And so it dictates the way that they're prosecuting the war.
Bolero gets underway in May, with the first 24,682 Americans arriving that month. Together with the roughly 12,000 in the UK before Bolero began, this gives a total of 36,644 US troops. So far, so good. But things have already started to break down behind the scenes. By mid-May, the Anglo-American working committees digging into the logistics quickly realized that the idea of bringing in 1 million men by April 1943 is little more than wishful thinking. Much of British shipping is focused on troop and supply reinforcements in the Middle and Far East, and American merchant shipping cannot handle this job alone. The target of 30 divisions is quickly revised down to 15, and the completion of a full-scale Bolero is pushed back to the summer of 1943. The U.S. War Department has also allocated just 12% of their manpower towards the Army Services of Supply, a ratio which should be about 30 to 40%. So many of those who do arrive over the next few months are without the right equipment and find accommodation and facilities unprepared.
There are also serious operational weaknesses, like there aren't anywhere near enough landing craft. In April, an American construction program began with a goal of building 2,500 for Sledgehammer and 7,000 for Roundup. That 2,500 is only enough, though, to carry half of the Sledgehammer force in one trip. And U.S. Army Assistant Chief of Staff Dwight Eisenhower admits the operation will make do with whatever personnel and equipment is actually available at the time. Likewise, the 7,000 craft earmarked for Roundup by Marshall is even lower than the War Department's recommendation of 8,200. We covered the development of the American landing craft, the Higgins boats, in one of our specials. It may be an ingenious design and maybe something of a war winner, but it does not do well in rough seas. By mid-May, the British have pointed out that rough seas is a real problem in the Channel in autumn. They recommend focusing on the much larger landing ship tank, or LST. The Americans accept this alteration and set out to build 765 LSTs by March 1943. But until summer 1942, the LST program will take a back seat to the construction of destroyers and carriers. Finally, there are political considerations that make Sledgehammer
Because the U.S. has a war in the Pacific, right? They're not very close to where the actual fighting is going on in the Pacific. They need the new naval ships in order to prosecute the war in the Pacific the way that they want to prosecute it. So again, you have this kind of divide between what would help in Europe and what the real focus of the U.S. is at this point, which is Japan.
appealing to the British. Weather restrictions mean it must be launched before August, when little more than one U.S. combat division will be ready. So the bulk of soldiers fighting and dying will be British soldiers, effectively giving Churchill moral veto over things, and he is not willing to risk another Dunkirk.
British Chief of the Imperial General Staff, Alan Brooke, will later write that his opposite number, Marshall, lacks strategic vision and that his thoughts revolve around the creation of forces and not on their employment.
Harsh.
But probably fair.
Oh yeah, don't get me started on Marshall and the B-17s. Anyhow.
By June, Sledgehammer is all but dead to the British. At the War Cabinet on the 1st, Lord Louis Mountbatten, Chief of Combined Operations Headquarters, recommends that it should not be attempted. On the 8th, Churchill decides that unless the Germans suffer a demoralizing failure against the Soviet Union, there could be no substantial landing in France this year. Churchill returns to his soft underbelly strategy, Operation Gymnast, the invasion of French North Africa. It looks like this will be an uphill struggle, though. Almost everyone in the US camp believes it is a cynical, imperialistic scheme by Churchill to use American manpower to secure Britain's position in North Africa and the Middle East. The British chiefs of staff are also opposed. They would rather ask for direct help from the Americans in Egypt. And anyway, Brooke thinks that any invasion should be held off until the future of Soviet resistance is clear.
But with the Second Washington Conference in June, Churchill has the chance to make the case directly to President Roosevelt. The two men have a series of meetings from the first day of the conference, the 19th, through the 21st. Records are scant, but at some point, Churchill has a breakthrough with FDR. Their subsequent memo doesn't say that Bolero, Sledgehammer, and Roundup should be nixed, but that Gymnast must be explored as an alternative. And crucially, if Gymnast does go ahead, its resources are to come from Bolero. So it looks like Churchill has just manipulated Roosevelt, right? Well, He has kept up the facade of sledgehammer, but is now sweet-talking the president into supporting his imperial scheme.
Well, he's certainly played a clever game, but it's not quite that simple. FDR has always been open to the idea of gymnast. In fact, Henry Stimson calls it the president's secret baby. He knows that much of the public sees Japan as the primary enemy. A victory against German forces will make the public feel that they are really in this fight against Hitler. And gymnast is much more likely to be successful than throwing inexperienced American boys at what would be stiff German defenses in France. Moreover, back in May, FDR rashly promised Soviet Foreign Minister Vyacheslav Molotov that the Western Allies were committed to opening a second front in Europe in 1942. While gymnast won't allow him to keep this promise, it will hopefully go some way to ensuring the stability of the Grand Alliance. And it's not as though gymnast isn't without its own merits. While it could be easy to dismiss it as a plot to shore up Britain's imperial position, all three allies will benefit. Without gymnast, Churchill fears that Egypt and the Suez Canal might be lost to Rome, clearing his path to the Middle Eastern oil fields and raising the potential of him linking up with a German drive into the Caucasus.
Yeah, the fear should not have been that Italy was going to take Egypt and the Suez Canal. That should not have been the fear. That probably did not have a prayer of happening. But I get it. The Germans overestimated Mussolini and what he would do also.
So, the Second Washington Conference ends with Anglo-American thinking muddled. The American military still believes that the British are in favor of sledgehammer. On June 23rd, Eisenhower travels to London to lead the American preparations for an attack across the Channel. Yet at meetings on July 6th and 7th, the Chiefs of Staff and War Cabinet finally formalized the decision made a month ago. Sledgehammer is rejected, and gymnast is identified as the more attractive option. Churchill sends this in a telegram to Roosevelt the next day.
When this comes to Washington, Marshall and King are aghast. With sledgehammer out of the question and a diversion to North Africa on the cards, it's going to mean yet more delay in dealing with Japan. They're so dissatisfied with the British attitude that on July 10th, they rather petulantly advise the president to leave Germany alone and devote all available resources to the Pacific. FDR knows that they are bluffing, and he brushes aside the rebellion. On the 15th, he orders the two men and his foreign policy advisor, Harry Hopkins, to Britain to sort out the mess. His memo orders them to continue investigating the possibility of sledgehammer. But he writes if wholehearted British cooperation is not forthcoming, they must find a compromise whereby Anglo-American forces can be in action against Germany by the end of 1942. The Americans arrive on July 18th. Things are tense. First, they snub Churchill's invitation to spend the weekend at Chequers, the Prime Minister's countryside retreat. Then there are several days of fractious meetings. Marshall presents a revised sledgehammer plan on the 20th. Brooke shoots it down. He tries again on the 22nd. Same result. He tries with Churchill later that afternoon. No luck. Meanwhile, King threatens a shift to the Pacific. That evening, Roosevelt intervenes and instructs his negotiators to abandon sledgehammer. Still, Marshall and King try to hold things up, and on the 30th, FDR is forced to exert his power as commander-in-chief. He orders gymnast, now renamed Torch, to go ahead at the earliest possible date and to take precedence over all other operations.
And with that, the die is cast. Bolero limps on for a few months, but from October, all focus and all resources are given over to Torch. An invasion of Western Europe in 1942, or 1943 for that matter, is out of the question.
This is actually all very interesting. I'm glad I did this video before putting out my video on why Germany could win World War II, because there's a lot of stuff that's connected specifically to a lot of the things that they have mentioned in here, like a lot. There's a lot that is connected to the things they've said in here. The position of the Allies early in the war is just not good, right? We see what the German military became later in the war. We saw what the Soviet Union military became once it got ramped up. And so when we look back in hindsight, we kind of view it in the way, like through the lens that it ended up working out. But yeah, at this time and leading up to this time, the alliance of the Soviet Union and Britain and the U.S. they are, for all intents and purposes, losing, right? Now, the Soviets are obviously in 1942, this is the year where things kind of get turned around, but it's not an immediate thing. And still, the Western Allies are not willing to put troops in France, which was what my original question was would they be willing to do it if the Soviet Union was going to collapse? Well, the thought process was yes, but the logistics of it and the reality of the situation was no, they weren't going to. There wasn't going to be a way they could make it work. And so that's very interesting. I'm glad that this video covered a lot of this.
Question. Anglo-American, Indian, and Free French forces go ashore in French Morocco and Algeria on November 8th, opening up the Axis underbelly. Western Europe must wait for its liberation. If you'd like to learn more about how America prepared for war in the first place, right, you can click right here to check out our World War II special episode about that.
Okay, so that was World War II, the 1942 plan to invade Europe. Like, comment, subscribe, and I will see you guys next time.